Good morning. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you are doing fabulous. It is halfway through the week and some of you are just getting started. Some of you are still hanging out in bed and others have been up for a while, just like me. If you are just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a girlfriend, a wellness advocate. I am studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. And I'm a jazzerciser, a runner. There's all kinds of things going on here. Part-time program director for NAMI, for the local affiliate of NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So again, if you're just stumbling on my page, I started Wellness Wednesday because over a lifetime of dealing with depression and anxiety, at different levels, I learned that that peer support is super important. And that sharing tips and tricks, even though they may seem like to us like they're things everybody should know, sometimes people don't know. And sometimes if you're watching, you may find that I get a little repetitive and that I repeat some of the same themes throughout episodes. But I've also learned that kind of like a kid when the parent tells them the same thing all the time, and then they hear it from somebody else and they're like, oh, sometimes we need to hear something like 8,000 times, and then 8,000 number one is when the light bulb goes on and it clicks. So repetitiveness is never bad. That's kind of how we learn. And as you're watching, if you have questions or comments on the positive side, of course, related to what I'm talking about, I encourage you to comment, interact. If you don't see this till afterwards, hit hashtag replay in the comments or ask a question or a comment. And just know that Facebook doesn't always show me all the things. So if you comment or ask a question and I don't answer you, it's because I didn't see it. And I will definitely respond after the fact, because sometimes Facebook just likes to hide things, and that's okay too. We'll work around it. So if you have been following me for a while, or if you caught last week's episode, it was about mental health awareness and the importance of it for Mental Health Awareness Month, which is May. And then last year for Mental Health Awareness Month, I covered misunderstood conditions. And what that means is things that we talk about in everyday life, where we talk about things like anxiety, depression, OCD or bipolar as if they are personality traits, when they are actually diagnosable mental health conditions. And sometimes the way we use them in casual conversation kind of dilutes the actual reality of it, and may sometimes add to the stigma. So it's important to know when we're referring to ourselves as someone else, or someone else as high anxiety or bipolar, that we know what we're talking about. And if we don't, we probably should use different language. So with that said, mental health terms are often used casually and out of context, which is, like I said, what causes misunderstanding and adds to the stigma. They're not, y'all, sorry, morning stuff. They're not buzzwords. They're real things. And the more we know, the more we can recognize real mental health conditions in ourselves and in others and act accordingly. Now, is the information I'm going to give you make it possible to go around diagnosing people? No. Even though I'm studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, I've learned not to try to diagnose people, and use it as more of an understanding of how to listen, as opposed to, oh, hey, you're freaking out today, you might have anxiety. That's not, a lot of people assume if you're studying something like what I'm studying, that you're walking around diagnosing everybody else. And if we did that, our brains would be completely exhausted. So we're going to talk about this a little bit today. Last year when I did the mental health misconceptions, there were quite a few people that reached out to me and were like, it would be great if you could do a deeper dive on this. I'm looking for my notes. And last year I covered, in one episode, I basically very barely touched on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 different conditions that we tend to refer to casually as if they're no big deal, as if they exist in everyone. And the truth of the matter is that more people may have mental health conditions than what we are aware of, but it's not walking around in everyone we see. And sometimes those casual conversations can kind of just make things difficult, if you will. And they often display our misunderstanding more than they display our understanding. So, let's talk today about depression and anxiety. That was one of the first things I covered in that episode from last year. And I have personal experience with this, so it seemed like a good place to start. So myth versus reality. A lot of times what this looks like in casual misuse is I have so much anxiety over this, insert the word, over this meeting, over this boy, over this event, etc. And on the other side, for depression, it may look like I'm so depressed that my favorite show ended. And we kind of toss out these words, and I'm guilty. I'm totally guilty of this. Before I ever knew that I had anything, that I had a mental health condition, or maybe I knew, but it wasn't actually confirmed by somebody that knew what they were talking about. I would toss out these words, and I'm still guilty of it because now it's become a habit. So I do make references like super high anxiety. This person's got super high anxiety. And a lot of times I'm coming from a place of personal experience, so I can kind of identify the signs, but it doesn't mean that's what they have, because it could be a temporary situation that is ramping up anxiety or nervousness. For example, today I have the privilege of accepting a big honor, and I'll go into more of that later once I learn when I can talk about it. And I think I may have touched on it a little bit last week, but normally situations like this would have me pacing in circles. They would have me pacing in circles, kind of imagining in my head what every piece or orifice of the conversation might look like and rehearsing my answer. And that is a sign of my anxiety that I'm in recovery from, not recovered from. Now, because I'm in recovery, I don't find that I have the same impacts from situations like this. Now I might just have a little bit of an upset stomach. I have more somatic symptoms pertaining to my anxiety. But I'm not pacing in circles and freaking out and trying to figure out how to escape the situation. And that's a huge, huge difference. So again, I have been guilty of this many times myself. But sadness or disappointment, if you're depressed that your favorite show ended, or that something happened that you weren't expecting or you weren't prepared for, that's actually sadness or disappointment. It's not actual depression. And sadness or disappointment are totally legit feelings, but we're human. So we feel those things, but they're temporary. They're not things that take root into longer term problems that impede our function. And the same thing with anxiety. Nervousness and short-term stress is normal. It's a normal human emotion that we all feel. However, true anxiety is not. True anxiety is something that manifests in several different ways and can very well, unless you're on the functional side, which is still a whole new problem, can very well manifest in things that interfere with your normal function. So let's talk some nerd facts, because if you've followed me for a while, you know that I love my nerd facts. Anxiety disorders affect over 40 million adults in the U.S. every year. That's 19% of our United States population. And I think those numbers are like as of 2021. I don't even think they're current. Major depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. Good morning, Miss Dawn. How are you today? Brain scans show different patterns of activity in those with either of these two conditions. And that's something that in my spare time I want to dig more into, because I actually want to see what those differences look like. Chronic stress and anxiety can shrink the part of the brain responsible for memory and emotional regulation, which is the hippocampus. I know, big words. Some of us know what that is. Some of us really don't care. And I never used to, but it becomes increasingly more interesting to me as I grow and evolve in my own space and as I learn. And then clinical depression is associated with somatic symptoms with or without emotions. So whether somebody is displaying the emotions normally associated with depression, if they have true depression, a lot of times those manifest in somatic symptoms. And sometimes in other cultures, it's not that they necessarily manifest in somatic symptoms. They do, but people don't know how to talk about them, or their cultural background doesn't allow to talk about them in the mental sense, because you can't see that. So they're described in the somatic sense, such as, I'm just really tired all the time and my body aches and I feel a lot of tension. So those are just a few nerd facts for you. So let's start talking about anxiety. I'm going to start with anxiety, talk a little bit about depression, and try to keep this close to 30 to 40 minutes because I know your time is important. But so is this topic. So what does anxiety really look like? The definition of anxiety, paraphrased, of course, from the DSM-5 TR, which is the current current text revision of the United States Diagnostic Manual. This is currently what I live by because I'm in Principles of Psychopathology. So persistent worry, restlessness, racing thoughts, panic, trouble concentrating, and physical symptoms like racing heart, nausea, sweating, blushing. Sometimes it may feel like a prolonged and excessive arousal state. For example, sometimes even if I don't feel like I'm stressed out, I experience the symptoms of being stressed out, like the fight or flight symptoms, like dry mouth and racing heart rate and feeling like, I could run at any given moment. And that's generally associated with certain, stress hormones that are elevated for whatever reason, which is likely comes from just years of being in that state on a regular basis. I actually have a friend who experiences a constant state of hyperarousal, and therefore needs medication to kind of settle that down in order to be able to function normally. So the most common types of anxiety are generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, and panic disorder, some of which can be comorbid with each other, and then lesser known. And when we hear words like separation anxiety, we typically think of small children, and that is a thing, but it's also often related to a developmental stage. But sometimes adults experience separation anxiety disorder, which is a little bit of a different animal. And then, of course, phobias. I've got a couple of those. But the most common that are most commonly talked about and most commonly diagnosed are generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and panic disorder. They are real things. They are things that happen and they have legitimate specific criteria, according to this guy, that defines whether or not that's what somebody with presenting symptoms is experiencing. So what does it look like for that person, or maybe a little bit from the outside, depending on how in tune you are with your loved ones? It looks like pervasive fears and worry that are out of proportion with the threat. So I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this from my experience, but a lot of times it's related to social anxiety, and most commonly what you would see is people freaking out or extremely worried, excessively worried about that somebody's going to judge how they look, what they're wearing, etc. When that's probably the last thing on the person's mind. So it's usually out of proportion with the perceived threat. I had a friend a few years ago who I didn't realize was experiencing anxiety, but when that person showed up to help with something out of the norm, their arrival was preceded with, "Don't judge me. I haven't showered. I haven't done this. I know I look terrible." And it was like a barrage of all these disclaimers. And because of my own experiences, I was like, oh my gosh, this is something. It was a side of that person I had not seen before. Good morning, Miss Kayla. It was a side of that person I had not seen before. So it was kind of a window into their inner anxiety, and I was only able to recognize it because of my own personal experiences. But social anxiety disorder, and I have some pretty good experience with that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Those symptoms can absolutely be crazy, but pervasive fears and worry that are out of proportion with the threat. That's really what that looks like. Just not a normal response to a perceived threat. And by perceived threat, I mean the threat may actually be there or it may not be, and it may be less or worse or better than what you perceive it, but you perceive it. If you have anxiety, you perceive it as a huge threat, and your body is you are psychologically and physiologically, all of those things responding to that perceived threat, whether it actually exists or not. So it also looks like impeding in normal functioning. So when I have severe rounds of anxiety, it looks like pacing in circles and replaying scenarios in my head, maybe for things that haven't happened yet. And it actually impedes in me being able to focus, because no matter how hard I try to focus on my work or my studies or whatever, I'm like, well, what about this and what about this? And everything's just kind of spinning here. And I describe it as brain spin because that's kind of what it feels like most of the time. So it's going to impede in normal functioning. And oftentimes, especially in the case, good morning, Miss Vicky, especially in the case of social anxiety or panic disorder, it's going to look like huge avoidant behaviors. So that you're avoiding those situations that trigger it. And that happens with phobias as well. The best example I have is, when I first started to identify my I didn't really start to identify my social anxiety at this point, but back in 2001, when I first started at the job that I was at for 21 years, I started at the front desk. I was the full-time front desk receptionist, and I was not aware of social anxiety at the time, didn't know what it was, didn't know what it looked like, didn't know I had it, and I may not have really had it yet. But when I go backwards and I look, the first sign of a problem was when I was asked to stand up for a photo and I turned red from here to here. And I was just very awkward and I couldn't get comfortable, and I started to struggle a little bit with my breathing. And again, I didn't know it at the time for what it was, but I had taken plenty of photos before, but for whatever reason in this moment, it became problematic and continued to be problematic and gradually get worse after that. So within this same job, I was talking about avoidant behaviors. I reached a point where a lot of people within my job, a lot of colleagues, associates, it was a member-based organization, and they would get together on the weekends. They would go to specific public places that were well known, and they would get together and they would talk and they would converse, and it would sometimes be very spontaneous. I was so terrified to see these people outside of work hours that I would go out of my way. We have a fantastic local hotspot with local food that is just amazing. And it was probably 3 years after they opened before I would walk in the door out of true, real fear of running into people I knew from work. Now, sometimes this can look different with different people. Like in my case, I did better with strangers than with people I was going to have to see on a regular basis. And sometimes for people experiencing social anxiety disorder, that's the opposite. They do fine with people they know, but they don't do well with strangers or in groups of people. So these were some of the first signs that I was experiencing social anxiety disorder, but it hadn't really ramped up to a point where it was starting to interfere with things. That's kind of what some of this anxiety looks like. Like I said, is pervasive fears and worry that are out of proportion with the actual threat. And they impede in normal function, and they often result in avoidant behaviors. Now, what they don't look like is being nervous before a test or before accepting something important, or being overwhelmed by a busy day. If you're already experiencing anxiety on a regular basis, those things can really ramp it up. But if you just experience a little bit of nervousness or a little bit of apprehension or a little bit of overwhelm, that's generally does not mean you actually have anxiety. Anxiety has to be these pervasive symptoms that go on most days, every day for more than a couple of weeks, before you can even really think about being diagnosed. An example of me kind of in my recovery is my residency last summer for school, where we had to do a 4.5-day intensive face-to-face, and we had this thing called a fishbowl experience, where we actually had to pretend to counsel a acting client, with everybody else in the room circled around us watching us. They described it as a fishbowl experience. And I checked in with myself periodically, and I was like, okay, I'm really not nervous about this. I'm really doing okay with this. I'm feeling comfortable. And then about an hour before it was my turn, I was in the bathroom. And I started feeling upset stomach, and I started feeling that dry mouth. So these were signs to me that I was in fact nervous, but because I have a little bit more control over my thought processes now. It manifests in different ways than it used to. It has more physical manifestations than it did, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So just because it doesn't look the same doesn't mean it's still not there. And again, in my case, I consider myself to be in recovery and probably don't meet all the criteria for this anymore. But it's still there, and it still can come back with a vengeance if I'm under the right conditions. So, again, with the general anxiety and the social anxiety, where it really came to a head for me, and we'll talk about that. I'll touch on this a little bit more when I get onto the subject of depression, where it really came to a head for me, where I realized I had a problem and I needed to do something to fix it, was when I was going on a date to a bonfire with someone I had known for a bit, but this was more of a date setting. But here's the kicker, is it was going to happen at a bonfire in a setting with more of those people that I worked with on a regular basis, even though this was years later. We're talking 4 years later, after I had started working for this organization. 4 years later, I'm going on a blind date, not really blind, at this bonfire where other people from that organization are going to be. And my daughter had a friend who lived up the street. It was a cul-de-sac. And there were a couple of things that happened in this time frame where the social anxiety really started to rear its head. And in this case, it was that I started freaking out. Now, I'm in like 3 layers of clothes because it's supposed to be cold as soon as the sun goes down. There's going to be a bonfire, so I'm dressed for cold weather. So I'm literally in 3 layers of clothes, standing in the foyer of my daughter's friend's home, okay? And I'm leaving my daughter there. She's going to spend the night, but I'm going to be right down the street until probably 11 or 12 o'clock, so no big deal. And then I'm going to go home. And they're watching me. And I am freaking out. I am literally freaking out. I'm pacing in circles. I'm in tears off and on. And I'm like, I can't go down there. What am I going to do? I got to get out of here. How can I get out of here without them seeing me? There was just this crazy racing loop of thoughts where I could not think of anything other than I've got to get out of here. I have to get out of here without anybody seeing me because I can't do this. And I can't really tell you anything else that was going on in my head other than that I realized when at some point during this episode that I had 2 teenage girls watching me and that I needed to get my shit together, basically. And that was a huge light bulb for me. And then a few weeks later, there was an incident where we were going to play paintball and other people from the organization that I worked for were going to be there. And I arrived early, same cul-de-sac. I arrived early. And as soon as I saw that truck that belonged to someone I was working with come up and drop their children off to play, that same thing happened again. I was sitting in my car trying to figure out, good morning, Miss Amanda, how to get out of there, how to escape without anybody seeing me, and how to get out of this commitment. And for me, ultimately, and this is not uncommon with anxiety, especially social anxiety, the fear of looking stupid for abandoning the situation or escaping was greater than the fear of whatever judgment or eyeballs or whatever that I thought I was going to have in that situation. And it is not uncommon. 2 things generally happen when you're experiencing severe anxiety or especially social anxiety is you muscle through despite the fear, probably because there's a greater fear in the background. And that was the case for me. Or you avoid. And I never could quite give into those desires to escape and to run. So in terms of fight or flight, I would show up and I would be terrified the whole time until I got too distracted to worry about what other people were thinking. And then it would wait until afterwards, and then I would reflect on every interaction I had during that time for the next week. Did I say this wrong? Why did they look at me like that? Blah, 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 blah. So that's some of my experiences, especially with social anxiety. And And again, like I said, the blushing, the pacing, the escaping, the negative thought loop that goes on and on. For somebody with general anxiety, this might look, or with social anxiety that has to do with the public, with public interaction. And I've done this before too. It might look like public speaking. They may be able to muscle through the public speaking, but they're rehearsing their speech for days on end prior in order to basically have it memorized because they're so worried about screwing it up. And that has happened to me before. So now let's talk about depression, because these two are actually interrelated. But let's move on to that. That's a basic overview kind of detail about anxiety. Now let's talk about what depression really looks like. So the definition of depression is a sad, empty, or irritable mood impeding in daily function for at least 2 weeks. And the most common types that we hear about or see are major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, and something called disruptive mood dysregulation. Also, you may or may not have heard of premenstrual dysphoric disorder. But a lot of times overall, without getting into specific disorders, what this looks like, what depression looks like, is a feeling of fatigue, a disinterest in things you once loved, like things that you used to go out of your way to do, you just don't have any interest in anymore. Fatigue, sleep disturbances, either sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. Appetite changes, again, that could be an increased appetite or a decreased appetite, and subsequent weight changes that come along with that. And sometimes psychomotor agitation / retardation, which means you're moving slow. You don't feel like your limbs are cooperating. And of course, reduced concentration / decision making, which can also come with anxiety. And recurrent thoughts of death. So not just fear of dying, but things like, what's the point? Kind of existential questioning, if you will. What's the point? Maybe it would be better if I wasn't around. I wonder what would happen if I wasn't around. It doesn't necessarily have to be specific thoughts of how to do it. But it is a more persistent focus on death in general. So y'all, this is not a bad mood. This is not the blues. And while post-event depression can be very serious, a lot of times it resolves itself within a couple of weeks. My last round of that did, and that was after my loved one had a hospital procedure, and I also had a very intense term. When I hit school break, I had this laundry list of things to do that I wanted to get done during my school break, and I could not find motivation. I was very tired. I felt like I was moving slow. I felt like I was in a brain fog. And and I've talked about that before as a post-event depression. It happens common in people after they've run a half marathon or a marathon, or they've been planning for a very seriously long time for a heavy duty goal, like an event at work. Kayla can identify with this. I used to plan events as part of my job, and sometimes they would just consume everything so much for a solid month or more that by the time I got to the end, I just literally was barely functioning through daily life for a couple weeks afterwards. It can look like not wanting to get out of bed or feeling like you physically can't get out of bed. So these, like I said, this is not just a bad mood or the blues. Those things are normal. Those things are human. We do all experience those, but they typically resolve themselves within a couple of weeks, whereas these depressive disorders go on for a long period of time. So I've experienced the post-event depression that's usually related to major life changes or major life goals that are once accomplished. But a lot of times for a lot of people, depression doesn't always look like this. Now, these are the terms used are the ones I already listed off, which are like the major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation. These are listed in here. There are other names that are not in here that are commonly used to refer to things like this. And you've probably heard me talk about this before if you've been following Wellness Wednesday for any length of time. And that's the smiling or functional depression, which looks from the outside when you're looking, let's say at me, you're like, oh, she's so gregarious. She's so outgoing. She's so energetic. Whereas on the inside, I was really good. I used to be really good. Now I'm just really energetic. Probably to the point of annoyance for some people. But On the inside for years, I was good at making it look like that. But when nobody was around, I was just, for lack of a better way to put it, using it as an adjective, I was dying inside. I was struggling to hold back tears a lot of the time for no apparent reason. And I was, I had a mixture of depression and anxiety where I was, I had the negative thought loop constantly. And if it wasn't worried about something that was about to happen, then it was worried about something that did happen, and I was ruminating. And one way to understand the difference between depression and anxiety is, the best way I've heard to describe is depression is a focus and excessive worry about the past, or rumination, where anxiety is an excessive focus about the future. So to me, that kind of breaks it down a little easier. When I was first diagnosed with depression, was when I went to a marital counseling appointment, and was the one and only one that we went to. And the counselor looked at me in mid-conversation kind of and said, and some of you have heard this story before, so again, apologize for repetitiveness, but sometimes you just pick up new things, right? And looked at me and said, how long have you been depressed? And I looked at him like he had 10 heads. And so he said, let me rephrase the question. When was the last time you remember being happy about anything that wasn't specific to an event or an incident for more than 2 weeks? And before he even finished that question, I was bawling. I was like a flood. I could have drowned the Titanic because I knew deep down inside that he was not wrong, and I could not answer that rephrased question. So at the time, I wasn't necessarily high anxiety, but I was very prone to melancholy. I was very prone to tears. I was prone to catastrophic thinking a lot, which was more on the anxiety side. And I often wondered if people's lives would be better off without me. It was not unusual. And they call it smiling depression at that point because it was not impeding in the daily function that everybody else saw. I could get to work. I could perform my duties. I could go home. I could clean the house. But it was like autopilot all the stinking time. And my counselor warned me at the time, and this is where we'll talk a little bit about the overlap here. Many people have both. Anxiety and depression tend to be very comorbid, and they very often go hand in hand. And my counselor at the time warned me that as I started to deal with the depression, it was like a scale, and they were very rarely ever equal. If one was up, the other was down, and vice versa. And it turned out to be true, to the point where as I started to deal with the depression, my anxiety not only ramped up and really showed itself when I didn't realize that was something I had prior, but it also became almost to the point of aggressiveness when I found myself in a fast food line one day getting ready to tear into, like, hop the stanchions that divide you up or guide you in line, getting ready to hop it to confront somebody because of the way they were treating the cashier. And if you've known me for any length of time, you know I'm really not a confrontational person. So the fact that I was standing in this public restaurant ready to just get in this guy's face and tear him a new one was a sign that something was a little bit out of control. And at that point, it was because I had been working on my depression, but in the process of reducing the depressive symptoms, the anxiety symptoms were coming up. So it is very often a balancing scale. There can be a lot of overlap, and a lot of times these functional disorders, and they call them functional because they're pervasive, because they've been with us for a kind of almost a lifetime or a very long duration of time, probably 2 years or more. And a lot of times we've just accepted that they're part of our personality, and that's just the way they're wired, so we don't think anything is wrong, or we've learned to function around it and kind of harness it to our good. And I was able, especially when I started college, to harness that anxiety to make it productive and fruitful so that I had control over my environment and I could stick to schedules and whatnot. And when that happens, and that means that those symptoms are not impeding in daily function, at least not visibly to us or to the rest of the world, then it becomes something more functional that's not necessarily diagnosable. And if you are someone that's been diagnosed with depression or anxiety, you may see some of that kind of go up and down, like where sometimes you're not exhibiting any symptoms for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, pull me out of pull me out of the hole, I'm losing it. So there is an overlap. And it is a thing, and they are very often two sides of the same coin. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up because your time is important, and this is something we could dig into for days. So why does language matter when it comes to talking about these things? Well, language matters because these are real diagnosable conditions that often need to be treated in some form or fashion, either with some kind of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or group support, or sometimes with medication. And when we misuse the terms, when we say things like, I'm so depressed my show ended, or I'm so anxious about this test, instead of language like I'm feeling nervous or I'm bummed out, when we use these things in casual use, or somebody's just a little extra excited on any given day, and you're like, oh my gosh, your anxiety's driving me crazy, which I've been guilty of. A lot of times what we're doing is we're trivializing. Whew, that was a big word today. We're trivializing the experience that somebody that has that mental health condition is really having. And we kind of dilute the reality of those that are struggling, and it adds to the stigma. So that's why language is important. So even with this knowledge that I've given you today, if you see somebody that you think has anxiety or depression, it doesn't mean you're qualified to diagnose. I'm not even qualified to diagnose yet. I'm still in practice mode. But they are real diagnosable mental health conditions, and we need to be, I'm not saying we should censor ourselves all the time, but we do need to be cognizant when we're using certain words, because things like depressed, anxious, this person's bipolar, this person's so OCD, I'm so OCD. These things get thrown around all the time, and they do minimalize what the experience of a real mental health condition that looks like that is. So, like I said, using accurate language like I'm feeling nervous about this test or this event, or I'm bummed out versus I'm depressed or I have anxiety is much, much better for casual use. So just a few things before I let you go that I want to remind you of. I guess my call to action would be to ask you who in your life might be silently struggling right now with something like this. And you don't know if that's what they really have or not. But it's okay to check on friends. It's okay to see if they need help, see if they want to talk. Now, what does that look like? It doesn't look like, hey, I see you have anxiety. Do you want to talk about it? It looks like, hey, it looks like you're struggling a little. Is there anything I can do for you? Do you want to talk about it? Offer a safe space for them to talk about whatever's going on. And then if you start to suspect because of what you're hearing or seeing that there's something more going on, then it's important to refer them to resources that can help them, that have more professional knowledge than you do or than I do, right? So it's okay to check on those people. It's okay to seek help. That's extremely important. There's still so much stigma attached with mental health conditions or seeking help. So much pride stuff going on there that it is very difficult, even if we're the ones that are struggling, to seek help. We need to normalize seeking help. If you will go to the doctor for a backache or a headache or an upset stomach or, a physical illness, why is it not okay to go when something up here isn't feeling right? It is okay. Our society and ourselves and our pride and that stigma has made it not okay, especially when we talk about those things in casual terms that reduces what other people might be experiencing. So it's okay to check on friends if you do it the right way. It's okay to seek help, and it's okay to normalize seeking help, like therapy, support groups, medication, whatever the case may be. And remember that there are resources out there. If somebody's in crisis, they can text 988 or call 988. That is the crisis line, the national crisis line, and they can be connected. They can pinpoint a general location of that person based on their phone and connect them with a more localized resource that they can talk to or chat with. NAMI Citrus. Here locally, NAMI Citrus is a fantastic resource. You can go to their website. There's a laundry list of resources available. We just had a meeting last night with Livestream to learn about all the services that they provide here locally. NAMI does free support groups for people that are living with mental health conditions, and also a support group for family members of people with mental health conditions. So there are, in fact, those support groups meet tomorrow night, every Thursday at 6 o'clock. If you are not local to Citrus, that 988 crisis line is still for you, and you can go to NAMI.org and find out who the local affiliate is nearest to you to find resources there. So it's okay to seek help. If you feel like somebody's struggling, they don't want to talk, be like, hey, have you ever heard about NAMI? They offer support groups. There are ways to help check on people, point them towards resources, and it's okay for you to seek resources as well. So once again, think about who in your life might be struggling right now. See if you can check in on them. You don't have to say anything, and like I said, you certainly don't want to be like, I see you're struggling with X disorder right now. That's not, no, just no. I don't even do that. But check in on them. Check in on yourself. And remember that it's okay to seek help, and that there are resources available, and that we have to start in general conversation normalizing that seeking of help. Okay, so that's it for today. Next week, we're going to talk about disordered eating. It's about a whole lot more than just food, and also something that kind of resonates with me. So if you found this helpful, or you think someone else will, please feel free to share it. If you have questions, comments, send me a message, drop it in the comments. And I hope you found this helpful, or that you can think of someone that it will be helpful for. We're going to keep taking a deep dive into some of these disorders for the next few weeks. A deeper dive, not a deep dive. We could be here for years. In any case, food. Kayla, you're so funny. So I'm expecting to see you next week for sure. Because you like to talk about food. I know you do. Whether it's good or bad, you like to talk about it. I know that we always do. So anywho, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I will see you next week to talk more about, it's really not personal, Kayla. I promise it's not personal. But hopefully you found this helpful. If you do, please share. And I will see you next week. And in the meantime, be well. Bye.